welcome everyone. Jeff Jensen, Director of Community Programs here with Trees Forever, and we have got a doozy for you today on Halloween. We're talking with Gina Buelow. She is going to be presenting on a spooky nature webinar. Gina is the Natural Resources Program Coordinator with Polk County ISU Extension and Outreach. That may be a surprise to some of you who the last time you saw Gina was a Trees Forever employee. So we wish Gina certainly success in her new position there, and she'll be doing a lot more of this sort of stuff in Polk and surrounding counties. I'm going to stop with that. Gina, take it away.
Okay. Can you see my screen okay?
I can.
Just let me know in the chat function if anything goes awry. But like Jeff said, I am talking about spooky nature today. And your screen isn't glitching out on you. The first slide is all of the pictures are in black and white because I thought that was extra spooky. But we have a lot of topics to cover today. I'm talking about a lot of different groups of living things, from animals like snakes and toads to fungi like mushrooms, and then even some plants. So the way I formatted this was I introduce a group of organisms, and I talk about some maybe misconceptions or myths or folklore about that specific group of animals or a specific animal in that group, or plant or fungi. And then I will talk about some real things that are a little bit spooky about these organisms, or a specific organism in that group. So I'll go ahead and start, and I am starting with mushrooms. Mushrooms are one of my favorite groups of living things. So this is called a fairy circle, and it's basically this ring of mushrooms. And the folklore behind this is that at nighttime, usually under the full moon, fairies will come out and they'll dance inside these fairy circles. And the bad news is that if you enter one of these fairy circles, you'll fall asleep for 500 years, or you'll be kidnapped by fairies. There is no scientific based, research on fairies. But what I can tell you about these fairy rings are how they develop naturally. And what happens is the mushrooms kind of start in the center, and they deplete the nutrients of the soils around them. And so they deplete the nutrients of the soil right there, and then they start spreading outward and outward and outward until it's this ring. So in this picture, all the mushrooms in that ring, everything inside that ring is depleted of nutrients, and everything outside of that ring still has that nutrients where the mushrooms could grow out further. Some of these mushroom circles, fairy circles, are centuries years old, and they come back year after year. And with mushrooms, what you're seeing here is really the tip of the iceberg. So those, we call them parasol mushrooms because they look kind of like umbrellas, but that's just the fruiting body. Underneath the surface in the soil, there are these root-like structures that mushrooms have, and they use those structures to absorb nutrients through osmosis with those structures. So underground, there's a lot of work going on too, but from the surface, all we see are these scary rings, and we let our imagination get away with us there with the fairies. Next is the idea that on a full moon, you are more likely to find mushrooms in large quantities, and also that every mushroom you pick under a full moon is going to be delicious and good for you. So this is something that is not true. There was actually a study done on the yields of mushroom foragers on full moons versus other stages of the moon cycle. And there is no discernible difference between picking mushrooms on a full moon or, a crescent moon. You're going to get about the same amount of mushrooms depending on, weather conditions, not the moon cycles. Another thing is that a mushroom that is poisonous, that is dependent on the species of mushroom, not the moon cycle. I always tell people to be 100% sure on the identification of any mushroom that they want to eat, because there are some mushrooms that are really bad for you to eat. And I'll get into a couple of those in the next slides. This is the mythological truth. So mycology is the study of mushrooms and fungi. And this mushroom right here is one of our toxic mushrooms. This is a jack-o'-lantern mushroom, and you can find this here in Iowa. What's especially scary about the jack-o'-lantern mushroom is it looks a lot like some of our really delicious mushrooms that we have, like golden oyster mushrooms and chanterelle mushrooms. Jack-o'-lantern mushrooms can look a lot like those mushrooms if you don't know exactly what you're looking for. One really cool thing about jack-o'-lantern mushrooms is that they glow in the dark. So they have a compound in their tissue, and it's very similar to the compounds found in jellyfish or fireflies that make them bioluminesce. And this is occurring in the jack-o'-lantern mushrooms too. So they can glow in the dark, which is just super awesome that this occurs naturally in this species of mushroom. A couple other spooky mushrooms, or spooky mushrooms in general. We have dead man's fingers on the left. So these are mushrooms that are kind of long and sausage-like, and they sprout up from the ground, usually around a tree stump, and it looks like somebody's reaching their hand out of a grave at you. So those are just super eerie looking, and that's how they got their name, dead man's fingers. Another thing is that they signify, certain species of this type of mushroom signify root rot in your tree. And that's also pretty spooky in my opinion. On the right, we have the destroying angel mushroom. And this is one of the most poisonous mushrooms in the world. And this is something that I myself have found in Iowa and the Midwest. So it is something that you can come across. And this is scary because it looks a lot like some button mushrooms that are non-poisonous. So that's why I say you should always be 100% sure about what you're eating, because unless you can pick up those subtle identification factors in mushrooms, you could be putting something really bad in your body. And with this mushroom, you might feel completely normal after ingesting it until about 6 to 24 hours later, and then you have severe stomach cramps and awful symptoms, and it can lead to death. Our next scary category is our scaly and slimy stories. So these are some things that are not so true about our frogs, toads, lizards, and snakes. So this first slide is about the association people have with salamanders, newts, and fire. So people used to believe that salamanders were born from fire, that salamanders emerged from flames, that they were these evil little beings that, were bad for people. And that is not true. So the reason people thought that salamanders came from fire was because they would build these big bonfires and bring over all of these logs. And that's where salamanders live. They love logs. They love wet, damp environments. So people would light these logs on fire, and the salamanders would scurry out of the fire trying to escape the heat and the dryness and the flames. And so people thought that the salamanders were being generated by the flames when in reality they were trying to avoid the flames. And that's why, a lot of people have this association too of, newts and salamanders being kind of a witchy thing. They just have a lot of folklore behind them in that sense. This is some folklore I heard for the first time when I was living in the Ozarks. So this is the story of the hoop snake. So the hoop snake, it's a snake that usually it's trying to chase a person or its prey, and it will put its tail in its mouth and form into a hula hoop shape. And it will chase the prey down or the person down and eat it. And this has never been confirmed. People report sightings of this, but there's no snake in North America that has been confirmed to show this behavior. The closest thing I could find was a snake in Asia that displays what people refer to as cartwheeling behavior. So that's pictured on the right. So this snake, when it's faced with a predator, it will sometimes fling its body almost in a cartwheeling motion down a hill. And the reason people think that this snake does that is one, because they make a lot of ground very quickly. They can go down an entire hill in a fraction of what it would take to slither down that hill. But also it really freaks out the predator. So imagine you're going after a snake and then all of a sudden it just starts flinging itself and flailing its entire body. That's kind of scary. So that is kind of maybe one version of the hoop snake that could be true, but still that snake isn't putting its tail in its mouth and rolling down a hill like a hula hoop. It's more rotating its body and flinging itself down a hill. One thing I would like to clear up really quick, because I'll be referring to things that are both venomous or poisonous, is really the difference between those terms. And there's, a lot of poisonous reptiles and amphibians. So we have things like poison dart frogs that are poisonous. And to be poisonous, it means that if something ingests you, or if their toxins get into your bloodstream through touch, that there are ill effects to that. So that is like, chemicals that you might consume that are poisonous. It's like dart frogs, where if you touch them, there will be ill effects there. But if a dart frog bit you, it's not injecting venom. To be venomous, it's something that has to be injected into your bloodstream. Likewise, if you ate a rattlesnake, obviously that's not a great idea, especially because rattlesnakes are incredibly awesome creatures that are often villainized. But if you ate a rattlesnake, their venom likely would not harm you because you ingested it, unless you had like a stomach ulcer or a way for it to get into your bloodstream. So that's the difference between something being poisonous and something being venomous. And like I said, there's a lot of frogs, snakes, lizards that fall into either of these categories. Oh, and the title here is True Herpetological Horror. And herpetofauna is what we call things like amphibians and reptiles. So I do want to clear the name of this creature right here. So there is this misconception that toads cause people to form warts, and that is not true. So you can see that toads have very rough skin. That's because they're terrestrially adapted frogs. So they have kind of this rough skin to help mitigate water loss. But right behind their eyes, you can see those big glands. That's what they are. They're not warts, they're glands, and they contain something called bufotoxins. And if something were to grab this toad or try to eat it, it would secrete those bufotoxins, and it would cause illness in the animal that tried to eat it. So this is a defense mechanism. It's not something that is contagious to humans. We're not going to get toad glands if we touch a toad. There are reasons that you should wash your hands after handling a toad because, you know, they can carry some bacteria, but you're not going to get warts from handling a toad. Here is a rough-skinned newt. So this is one of the poisonous critters I was talking about. And rough-skinned newts are incredibly toxic. So I would hear this story when I was studying wildlife biology. I don't think the story has been confirmed in any way, but there is a little bit of credibility to the story just because this critter is so toxic. So the story is that a group of lumberjacks went into the woods and made a camp, and then they never returned home. So people went out to look for the lumberjacks, and they found the camp, and all of the lumberjacks were dead. And they couldn't figure out why everyone had died because there were no wounds or anything. And then they look inside the coffee pot, and there's a rough-skinned newt inside. So that's implying that the rough-skinned newt is so toxic that it killed all these people just from being inside their coffee pot and, you know, leaching its toxins into the coffee that they drink. And while, like I said, I can't confirm that story actually happened, these newts do have the capability to kill dozens of people with the amount of toxins that they have in their bodies. Another interesting fact about the rough-skinned newt is that they have this kind of evolutionary arms race going on with garter snakes. So garter snakes and rough-skinned newts both occur in the Pacific Northwest. And the garter snakes started to develop and evolve this resistance to the newt's toxicity. And in return, the newts started to become even more toxic. And in return, the garter snakes developed even more of a resistance. And this kind of snowballed into a result where these rough-skinned newts in this particular area are just incredibly toxic. So the area where they overlap with these garter snakes, they just have very, very potent toxins. The next story I'd like to tell is a story that I just love telling at any excuse I have. So this is the story of the brown tree snake in Guam. So in Guam, there is a military base, and it's hypothesized that at some point, you know, airplanes and cargo was brought in that contained these brown tree snakes that I believe are native to Australia. And these snakes were turned loose, and they ate a lot of the native wildlife. I believe they've caused most of the native birds to go extinct. So they're just ruining the ecosystem of Guam. So that's scary in itself, but people really care about this specific invasive, not only because of the ecological effects, but because they cause power outages. They like to slither up onto the power lines, and oftentimes will cause these power outages. They're not super big snakes, but they'll still cause damage and these outages on the island. So the response people had to this was this really creative, wild idea where they took these dead mice and filled the mice with poison. And then they equipped the mice with little parachutes. And then they flew over Guam and threw the mice out of the helicopters onto the island. And the snakes did eat these poisoned mice. It didn't get rid of the brown tree snakes in Guam. There's still a massive problem, but it was a technique people were using to try to mitigate this issue of this invasive species. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about a really infamous bird. So this is the American crow. And so what I can gather when I read about superstitions about crows is if you see one crow, it's a bad omen. But if you see two crows, it's a good omen. So that is kind of maybe the general belief. But people kind of have this idea that crows are scary, or that they're, a signal of impending doom. But really, these are really intelligent creatures. So crows are birds that can use tools. They can craft their own tools, actually. So they've done this in a lab setting before, but they also do it in nature where they take these pliable twigs and kind of create like a hook so they can access prey items or food items. Another interesting thing about crows is a project that was piloted in, I believe, either Switzerland or Sweden, where they were training these crows to pick up cigarette butts. I don't believe this is a widespread way that they're trying to pick up cigarette butts, because it involves this really costly contraption where the bird takes the cigarette butt from the street and drops it in the machine. And then the machine dispenses some treats for the bird. So they are capable of being trained to do this. Whether or not that's cost effective to clean up cigarette butts is another question. But these birds are highly intelligent and important to the environment, and just really interesting to learn about. Another thing, kind of a superstition about birds, is that if a bird flies into your window, that's a bad omen too. And I would just like to take this opportunity to talk about birds flying into windows. So birds do fly into windows at a pretty substantial frequency because they do not see the reflection in the glass. So where we see a reflection, they just see open space. So birds will try to fly through that. And then they bump their heads and they either kind of instantly die or they're very dazed. One way that we can prevent this from happening is by putting stickers on the window so they can see that it's a solid space. Another thing that people can do is to turn off their lights. So it's especially confusing to birds at nighttime when they're flying. If an office building has its lights on, that might be an opportunity for a bird to fly into a window. If you are, witnessing a bird flying into a window, what I've learned from animal rehabbers is if the bird is still alive after hitting that window, you can pick the bird up with a towel and you put it in a cardboard box and close the lid. And oftentimes the bird will come to after kind of reorienting itself in the darkness for a couple hours. But this is something that is unfortunate that happens to birds pretty often, but by no means is it a signal that, something bad is going to happen to you. It's more, preventing it through window decals or turning off the lights. So here are some actually scary facts about birds. So this bird here is called a shrike or a butcher bird. And it earned its name by impaling its prey on barbed wire fences or thorned trees or shrubs. And there's a couple reasons why the butcher bird might do this. So the first is the convenience of having your prey skewered in a nice little storage location. So you can kind of decorate your territory with your prey. It also is increased in frequency around mating season, so it might also be a signal that you're a good mate if you have a lot of prey impaled in your territory. Another reason they might do this is because some of their prey items, like lubber grasshoppers, they have an element of toxicity to them that is depleted over the course of 1 to 3 days. So the shrike can take that grasshopper, impale it on a barbed wire fence, and come back to it later when the toxins are a little bit depleted. So this is a scary thing to behold. Oftentimes too, it's not just insects. They also eat small mammals and other birds. So it is pretty creepy to see. But think about all the insects that they're eating and impaling, and their contributions to the ecosystem too. Okay, this is another story I love having the excuse to tell, and that is the story of the cowbird. So cowbirds are called brood parasites. So that means that they don't build their own nests and take care of their own babies. What they do is they find an already established nest from a bird of another species, and they lay their egg in that nest. And then the other bird will parent their offspring. So for the longest time, people just thought that the victim in the situation, the bird that has to take care of the cowbird baby, they thought that that bird was just too dumb to realize that, you know, this chick in their nest was not their baby. And oftentimes when these cowbirds are put in these nests, they hatch first, they get bigger, they take a lot of the resources, and sometimes they'll even push the other babies out of the nest. So people thought that birds just aren't intelligent, they can't tell the difference, even though these eggs obviously look pretty different. But what scientists realized was that this behavior of accepting the parasite into their nest is because the parent cowbirds, they'd come over, scout out the nest, lay their egg in the nest, and then they'd stay and watch. And if they saw that mom bird that owned the nest, if they saw them push out the cowbird egg, the cowbirds would come back and smash all of the mom bird's eggs. So they evolved this behavior of just letting the cowbirds stay because they didn't want to deal with the retribution from what some scientists refer to as the cowbird mafia. So I just think that's amazing that that behavior happens in birds. It's just crazy to me. Next, I'm going to move on to our insects. So this is the death watch beetle. And this beetle is wood boring. And it can be found in old lumber and old houses. And one behavior that the death watch beetle exhibits during mating season is it will make this clicking or knocking sound. And people would hear this sound at night, oftentimes when they're having restless sleep, and they decided that that clicking sound was the sign that you were going to die. And that isn't true. These birds are just not birds. These beetles are just trying to attract a mate. But that was a very common story that was told about these insects. Our next insect that I'll talk about is the earwig. So earwigs do look a little bit creepy, I'll admit, because they have those pinchers on their rear ends. But the thing I've heard about earwigs that I'll just go ahead and say is not true is that they will crawl inside of your ear and eat your brain. And they do not do that. The last thing that an insect or spider wants to do is to go in a hole that is wet and stinky. They can't find any food there. So earwigs do not do that. And I'm not saying that no insect or spider has ever gone in someone's ear, because that is something that happens every once in a while. But it's not something they're seeking out to do. It's an accident if that happens. And earwigs are actually incredibly cool animals. So you can see that GIF I have playing is its wings folding and unfolding. And people have described this folding pattern as breaking the laws of origami. They're fitting a lot of surface area of the wings in a very little casing. Another thing about earwigs that is super cool is they are part of the 1% of insects that show parental care. So they're actually very good mothers. They take care of their babies and protect them. And earwigs are just really cool little bugs, and they're not gonna try to go for your brain. Another interesting insect that is actually a little bit scary is the bombardier beetle. So this beetle here, it has two liquids that are inside of its abdomen, two different chemical compounds. And when those compounds are mixed, it creates this spray of this hot toxin. And so when a bombardier beetle is threatened by a predator, it will mix these fluids in its abdomen and squirt it out. Sometimes it gets into the predator's eyes, and that gives the beetle enough time to escape. This also can cause a skin irritant for people too. So this is just a wild, scary thing that this beetle does. This is another scary bug fact, and this actually has to do with mushrooms too. So there is a mushroom that is a parasite of ants, and the mushroom will take over this ant's nervous system, and it will cause the ant to display these weird behaviors that kind of drive the ant to go into an environment that is suitable for the mushroom to spore and disperse. So the ant will leave its colony. Oftentimes it will go to the underside of a leaf, and it will hang there by its mandibles. And it'll be, a humid place that's a little bit warm for these mushrooms, and then they'll be able to spore and infect more ants. So I believe I keep forgetting the name of this series, but there's a series, I believe, on Netflix or HBO about zombies. It's a newer series, and that is the idea that that series is based on, because the zombie creatures there are kind of mushrooms too. Next, I'm going to talk about some arachnids. So this guy pictured here is known as a daddy long-leg. And one misconception people have about these arachnids is, one, that they're spiders. This creature pictured here is not a spider. He is an arachnid and very closely related to spiders, but they do have some different traits. The other misconception people have is that daddy longlegs are the most venomous spider in the world, but they have too tiny of fangs to bite you. That's not true. the venom of the actual long-legged spiders that look similar to this but are really spiders, their venom is not very strong at all, actually. And also, if you think about it, the venom that these spiders have is specialized for insects. So it's not something that, they've evolved to hunt down humans. No, it's, they're catching these little bugs. Next is the story I heard a lot in grade school, and that's the idea that on average, people swallow 8 spiders a year. And I included this comic of somebody saying that, well, actually, most people don't eat any spiders, but there's one person that eats 40 spiders a day, and that throws off the average. But really, I don't know where this tall tale came from. Like I said, spiders and other bugs are not, loving the idea of going inside your mouth. That is, a wet, stinky place that has no food. They'd, rather be in a place where they can catch their prey. And I think spiders have a bad reputation, but they are, like so many of the creatures I talk about in this presentation, so important to the environment. Think about all the insects and other little creepy crawlers that they eat. They're really useful little critters. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about bats. So the first thing that some people believe about bats is that all bats drink blood, and that is not true. There are some bats called vampire bats that do drink blood. Oftentimes it is not human blood. Usually they go after livestock. But a lot of bats eat insects, and they actually eat so many insects a night. And a lot of them are mosquitoes too. So bats are really good for kind of curbing the mosquito population. And then a lot of bats also eat fruit. So not every bat drinks blood. There's also the belief that bats are just rats with wings, and that's not true either. So I looked up how rodents and bats are related, and bats are actually more closely related to hooved animals like cows and horses than they are to rodents. And I thought that was a really interesting fact. Another fact, and this is specifically about vampire bats. So vampire bats recognize their family, and they kind of look out for each other. So when bats are feeding, they store some of the food that they have harvested. So bats will store what are called blood meals, and they'll return to the colony, and sometimes they'll share blood meals with their friends and family. And what's interesting is we can see a correlation of how much they share and the relatedness of the bat that they're sharing with. So if you're my brother, I might give you half of my blood meal because we're pretty closely related. But if you're my cousin, I might only give you 1/4 of my blood meal. And then if you're my friend, if you share with me pretty often, I'll share with you pretty often. But if I haven't noticed that you've been avoiding me and not giving me any blood meals, then I'm not going to share with you either. So they are recognizing each other. They do have this sense of who's their friend and who they're related to. Next, I'm going to go into some plants. So a lot of these plants I actually learned about from a webinar that I watched by Dr. Cindy Haynes. And this is one that she mentioned. It is foxglove. And foxglove, the name actually is maybe derived from the term folksglove, like wee folk, like little fey creatures and fairies. So people thought that, fairies used these flowers as little homes or hats or decorations. And there's no science-based evidence of fairies, like I said before. But that's just a cool little folklore tidbit about foxglove. They're also poisonous plants. You should not eat them. But one interesting thing about organisms that have these toxic compounds is sometimes we can isolate certain properties of those compounds and use it for human innovation. So there are medicines that have compounds that are found in foxglove that we use for medicine. Next, this is the ghost flower. So if you know anything about plants, you know that plants go through photosynthesis, so they have chlorophyll, and that's why a lot of plants are green. They also have some other components as well, like carotenoids and stuff that make pigments orange. But this flower is white, and it also grows in the dark. So it's pretty interesting. And the reason that this happens is because it has this relationship with a fungus. And the fungus, which is underground, takes care of all the digestion of the nutrients and gives it to the plant. And the plant is able to grow without actually undergoing photosynthesis itself. So it doesn't need the chlorophyll. So it's not green anymore, it's white. Another plant that I learned about recently is the gas plant. So this plant emits this volatile gas. And if you hold a lighter up to it, it bursts into flames. The gas around the plant bursts into flames for a second. And that's super interesting. And then also this plant, it will sometimes cause allergic reactions to people if they touch it, because it has this chemical in it that's photosensitive. So if you get it on your skin and then go into the sun, sometimes that causes a reaction in people. I also have these two plants that are just creepy looking. The one on the left is called doll eyes, and the little fruits or flowers there look a lot like little eyeballs. And then the plant on the right is called the bat-faced flower. And that's just a really creepy looking plant that looks a lot like a bat's face. So a lot of the things that I've been talking about, they kind of get your wheels turning in your brain about, what does this mean? What does this behavior mean? What can explain this? And I'd like to talk about the spookiest thing of all now, which is scientific misinformation. So a lot of these tall tales and folklore and misconceptions get started because people hear things and spread it. And so this is one thing that I see posted a lot on like my Facebook. I'll see it maybe once every 3 months. And this is just an example, but that's this idea that bull sharks are really far up in the Mississippi River, that they've been spotted in the Great Lakes. So if you see something like this, the first thing you should think about is where you're seeing it or where you're hearing it. So are you saying it, are you hearing it from, one of your friends that goes out fishing and he says, oh, I saw a shark? How much do you trust that friend? And, could he have seen a log in the water or just a really big fish? Another thing is think about the website that you see it on. So this particular example, this is a YouTube video. And on YouTube and Facebook and a lot of these news sites, they get money for people clicking on links. So if you see something that seems a little bit outlandish on one of these websites, they're probably just trying to get you to click on their link so they can get that view and that monetary reward out of it. Another thing you should think about that isn't so relevant to this example, but also when was the information posted? So if I was looking up information about armadillo range in the United States, if I was looking for an article on that and I found an article from the 1950s, I would see a different range than exists today because armadillos are kind of migrating northward in the United States. They're in southern Missouri now, which is really interesting. But depending on where you see the information and when it was posted, it might be outdated. We might know more now than we did before. One website that I use to kind of fact check thing is Google Scholar. So instead of being a search bar where you type and it brings up just any website, this only brings up peer-reviewed articles and publications. I will say though that not every scientific journal is 100%, credible on everything. There are some scientific journals where anybody can publish if they pay enough money. And there are also studies that are funded by sources that have something to benefit from the results being a certain way. So you always keep that in mind too. But I did type into Google Scholar bull sharks in the Great Lakes and nothing came up. And that is because nobody's going to pay for a study to look for bull sharks in the Great Lakes because they are not there. What I did instead was I looked on regular Google and I found a credible news outlet. And I saw that there have been reports or sightings of bull sharks in the Great Lakes, but none of them have been confirmed. So like I said, reports and sightings, that could be anyone out on the lake, seeing something that maybe looks like a shark, but isn't necessarily confirmed as being a shark. So that's why we need to think about, this information before we click share. And sometimes these things can be really harmful to the species that it's targeting. Like a lot of these tall tales about rattlesnakes and stuff, they make people go out there and kill snakes. And that's not something we want because they're very important to the environment. So with all these things that invoke curiosity and get your wheels turning, always fact check things. A lot of the folklore is super fun and super culturally important, but it's always important to remember what's based in science. So thank you for joining us for Spooky Nature. If you have any questions, please let me know in the chat and I'll try to answer them the best I can.
Okay, Gina, wonderful presentation. That is just amazing, some of the stories you had to tell. So flower the same as Dutchman's pipe?
I believe it is. I believe that is another common name for that plant.
Okay, excellent. Well, throughout your presentation, someone asked, could you please add the geographic location of the creature's territory that you're talking about? No need to go back in time, but out of the ones that you kind of talked about in general, which ones would be relevant to us here in Iowa that would affect us?
A lot of the plants I talked about either occur naturally in Iowa or are house plants that people can, raise. Like if you really want a bat-faced flower, that is something that's possible. We don't have the rough-skinned newt here in Iowa, but I believe we are still in range of the central newt, which is also toxic. So typically when I've handled those in the field, you need to wash your hands, especially between holding that animal and another animal, because you can pass on some of that toxicity.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for clarifying there. Well, a lot of praise for Gina. This was an interesting one today. Well, I was interested in the bats, and
Yeah.
for no other reason, because I had a chance to see a bat up close and personal at the Greater Des Moines Botanical Gardens here this past weekend with their Trick or Trees event, and they even had a bull snake that they had that I touched, and it was very interesting and not slimy at all, not at all.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I found that fascinating because, of course, we have bats. Infamously, my father broke his knee trying to get a bat falling off a bucket, and so
Mhm.
um, it's something that we're always aware of. And so, thank
Yeah,
you for shedding some light on that.
one thing I will say about bats is they also have a bad reputation because of rabies. Um, Bats, 1% of bats have rabies. So if you do find one in your home, that's something you need to, check out and get the vaccine for. But like I said, they're oftentimes villainized because of the whole rabies thing and the vampire bats. But there are so many endangered bat species, and they do a lot of good for the ecosystem too.
Aren't they like Hoovers, just sucking up
Yeah, so
insects, I
they
guess?
kill a lot of mosquitoes.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, here's a real quick question. Is it true that a bat can bite you without you even knowing?
Yes, that is true. So that is one reason why if you find bat droppings or a bat lives in your house, that you should get checked out for rabies. Rabies is a terrible, terrible disease that is almost 100% lethal if you start showing symptoms. But if you catch it right away before you start presenting the symptoms, then you can get the vaccine and be okay.
Question about earwigs here. Um, oh, I just had a question, so it moved down on me. Why do I see earwigs around my flower pots or my flowers? Are they harmful in any way?
I do not believe that the earwigs are harmful. I do believe that they are detritivores, so they eat a lot of dead things. So they're probably acting as a cleanup crew for your garden.
Excellent, excellent. Oh, okay, so here's an interesting one. So you spoke on how to help birds that have ran into the windows. You should
Mhm.
put them in a box, cover that box up, and just wait. Someone wants to know then, so do you eventually come back and open up the lid, or will they work their way themselves out, or just how does that work?
Yeah, so that example was something that actually happened to me where I found a yellow warbler in downtown Iowa City that had run into a window. I called an animal rehabber and they said, put the bird in a box and leave the box alone and then come back, a couple hours later and open it up for the bird.
Gotcha. People saying, yes, I love our backyard bats for their mosquito-eating vigor.
Yeah.
Oh, is it true that bats will want to crawl in bed with you to stay warm? What?
I've never heard that. Um, I I think similarly to our spiders and insects, that bats don't really want anything to do with us. I think they probably would rather be alone with their mosquitoes.
Okay. And then what do you know about Venus flytraps? They kind of sound creepy.
Yeah, so I knew I would get a question about Venus flytraps because they are creepy plants. But Venus flytraps are plants that grow in areas that are very depleted of nutrients in their soils. So in order to get that extra nutrients, they have evolved to capture living insects and digest them for that nutrients. So if you touch the hairs kind of around what looks like a mouth of the Venus flytrap, it will close and then it can digest that insect and get that nutrients.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, I think we've come to the end of the hour here. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you, certainly, Gina, for sharing this wonderful presentation here. It'll be recorded. We'll be sure to get it up and onto our YouTube page. And hey, stay warm, everyone, and happy Halloween.
Yep, thank you so much.